I do have some handouts. I should have addressed that earlier, but I didn't. Thank you, sir. We've been recording this. Somebody hit the play button, but that's okay. It kind of gets us into what goes on before the sermon. Answering common challenges. Thanks for reading, Joe. People do ask us questions, and having answers is a good thing. Part of our Christianity is growing up in our discipleship so that we'll be in a position to answer questions. Thank you, sir. Ephesians 4, 13 through 15. We talk about that from time to time. And it talks about that we have the knowledge of the Son of God to a mature man, to the measure and stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. And as a result of that, we're not to remain as children. Because if we are, we'll be tossed about by winds and waves and subject to false teachers and their schemes and conniving. But we're to speak the truth in love so that we can grow up in all things into Him who is the head, Christ. In Colossians 1, 28 and 29, writing to a church that he didn't start, Epaphroditus did, and that he probably didn't know personally, but that he knew what Epaphroditus had taught them because everybody taught the same thing. He said that with regard to Christ and Him being the Gentiles' hope, Him we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom, that we may present everyone mature in Christ. With this I toil, struggling with all His energy that He powerfully works within me. So again, we see that part of our Christianity is to grow to maturity so that we can have conversations with people as we go along. Romans 8:29, which we mentioned here and there along the way. We mentioned it in our lesson this morning about foreknowledge and predestination. Whom He foreknew, He predestined to become conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brethren. So, there are challenges that the world offers us, and we need to be equipped. We'll never be perfectly equipped. I taught at the School of Preaching for 30 years, and every time I thought I'd heard everything, I realized that I had not. And they would come up with some very interesting things. Common challenges. One, the Gospels were written a generation after, and they're pieced together by the church. You may have heard that one. It's out there. It amazes me how things like this get as much play as they do. A guy by the name of Bart Ehrman, who is a trained scholar, got a doctorate, for goodness sakes, and has taught New Testament. He has come out with some things that cast aspersions on the gospel, saying that, I just said, they were written a generation after the events happened, not by eyewitnesses, not by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so a lot of people believe that. I periodically watch things on YouTube where people out in the world are hurling their questions at people. And this is one of the ones. I hear that. They don't know really anything about it, but they hear that this is being said. Well, first of all, Paul, who wrote the canonical gospel, Paul, who wrote before the 4 canonical gospels, they say, didn't know anything about Jesus, because we don't really find out about him until later. So there's Paul writing sooner than them, and he didn't really know what's going on. So that's one of the things that they say. And that the church made up that Jesus was God. So, well, how about that? Early church writers knew the apostles. They actually knew that Polycarp was a disciple of the apostle John. And he talked about his relationship with John and the things that John told him and the other apostles. Also, it has been said that if we lost the Bible, the New Testament, we could put it back together by looking at the writings of the church fathers, because they're constantly quoting, and indeed they do quote from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we do have evidences that what is being said is not true. Paul clearly assumes a knowledge of Jesus. I mean, why would he mention him as often as he does? Think about it. You can look at any of his epistles, and what is he talking about? Jesus, Christ Jesus, the Lord. Well, if he doesn't know that the people he's writing to know who he's talking about, they're just going to be going, I wonder who that guy is that Paul's talking about, that Jesus fellow. So they know what he's talking about, and he knows they know what he's talking about. Now, part of that may be that these things that we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John survived or started with oral traditions, which it has been shown that oral tradition cultures pass things down for generations and generations, hundreds of years, accurately. Because most people didn't have books, they certainly didn't have electronic devices or anything like that, and so they used their memory a lot more than we do, and they communicated in ways that they remembered. So, Paul also said, when he's writing to the Corinthians about the resurrection, that there are 500 people who witnessed Jesus in his resurrection, and that most of them were still alive. So obviously, there was a lot that was known about Jesus when Paul is writing. It isn't that he doesn't know anything. He knows that they know what has already been out there, has circulated around. Also, Paul met with the apostles. He goes, to Jerusalem, and he's a little worried about how that's going to go, and it goes very well. So the apostles are there in Paul's ministry. Paul was probably converted. Jesus probably was crucified in 30 AD. And Paul he has to start to everything to work out chronologically between 32 and 33. So within 3 years of Jesus' crucifixion, Paul is converted, and he starts interfacing with the folks in Jerusalem. Paul was proclaiming the central message about Jesus within 20 years of the resurrection in his writings. He talks about that. He probably has in his writings, it's pretty certain that he does, hymns that the early church sang about Jesus. So it's not like he's a made-up figure. Luke says that he checked everything out. He went around and talked to people about what he had encountered from what we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he verified that those things were true, because most of the people that could have talked about those things were still alive. The people and events of the Gospels have not been shown to contradict archaeology or history. So there's an amazing amount of accuracy there. Luke, who writes Luke and Acts, they're kind of a combo, 2 volumes of that. There was a fellow many years ago who decided that this was all a bunch of rubbish, and so he was going to go out and debunk Luke. He became a believer when he realized that the various minute details that he had about various rulers and sub-rulers and local rulers and all that kind of stuff absolutely checked out. There is an enormous amount of consensus within the Gospels. They see it from different points of view, but it's all clearly the same Jesus that they're talking about. And who would have invented Jesus? If you've read much or any of the church fathers, so-called, you can find all kind of things. It's been said you can prove anything you want to with the church fathers, because they were philosophers and what. They got into all kinds of speculative things. So who is the person in the early church that invented Jesus, that put these Gospels together, that had the genius to come up with this person, Jesus, that the world still looks to and is amazed at his teachings? I was reading just the other day about a Harvard ethicist. He studies ethics. He teaches ethics at Harvard. And he said that everything after the Sermon on the Mount is a footnote. How about that? So, Now, this allegation that Ertman does this, that Jesus never thought he was God. He never talked about being God. Well, let's just see. In John 8:57-59, so the Jews said to him, "You're not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" He said, "Abraham saw my day, and he was glad for it." Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him. Why'd they do that? He's claiming to be God. Before Abraham was, I am. Then in John 10, beginning with verse 30, I and the Father are one. The Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Why are they picking up stones? Because he, being a man, claimed to be God. So John 20:24-28. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with the others, when Jesus came. And so he comes back, and they say, "We saw Jesus." And what does he say? "I won't believe this unless I can put my hands in the holes in his body." So then Jesus appears. He says, "Okay, check it out." And he does. What does he say? "My Lord and my God." He understood the significance of that. So, the fact that the Gospels are said to have been written well after the fact, and the church just made it up, it doesn't hold water. There are all kinds of ways that we can say, no, that just won't stand up when we put the evidence out there. Now, here's another thing you may have heard, that and Ertman does this too. There are thousands of variations among the manuscripts, like thousands and thousands of variations. And we go, oh no, how can we know what the truth is? Well, first of all, there are over 20,000 manuscripts of various things that either outright manuscripts copying the books or things that the church would use in readings and things that are in the church fathers. So there are about 20,000 sources that we can go to look at what was actually the original. The vast majority of variations are you ready for this? Shocking news here. Misspelled words and transposed order of words, which of course changes everything. I've seen this from a lot of people, and obviously it's the truth, that 98.3% of the New Testament is without question. The science of looking at manuscripts and looking at what was originally there are very definite rules of how this is done. It's done with ancient literature, not just the Bible. And, 98.3%. What about the 1.7%? Okay, the biggest part of that is in the long ending of Mark and the woman taken in adultery. Okay, so if we take the long ending of Mark out, we take the woman in John 8 out, have we lost anything that we wouldn't get anywhere else? No, we haven't. The woman taken in adultery rings true to how Jesus operated. There's nothing about it say, well, he wouldn't do that. No, that's just the kind of thing that he did. And the long ending of Mark, which has the Great Commission sending people out to preach the gospel to all creation, he that believes and is baptized will be saved, believeth not will be condemned. Well, do we not know that from something else? Well, of course we do. There's a great harmony there. Actually, the New Testament documents provide us with a tremendous store of evidence about what the original documents would have been. More so, by far, than any other ancient document that are taken for granted. The Gallic Wars of Caesar, for instance, nobody questions them. You find them quoted along the way by historians in books about Caesar, Julius Caesar. You find those kinds of things. Well, compared to the Bible, it's just not even close to be able to establish what did Julius Caesar actually say. And yet nobody really doubts what he said. Here's one that I find interesting. William Shakespeare. There is more evidence to the original readings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John than there is the original readings of the plays of Shakespeare. You don't find people going crazy about Shakespeare. Well, how do you know what he said? And things like that. So one of the things I picked up on a long time ago that I think is a very accurate thing is if you don't have a good argument, you're left with bad ones. And if you really don't have a good argument, you're left with really bad arguments. But people who don't know, if you say things loudly, one of the things about communism that was said, if you say something loud enough, long enough, people will believe it. And unfortunately, that is true. And there are a lot of people who, if you will, parrot some of the things that we've been talking about as objections, and they just pluck it out and say it without realizing what they're saying. One of the people I listen to who goes around to college campuses and just, whatever you got, throw it at me, let's see what we can do with it. And they get kind of lathered up, and what do you mean talking about Jesus? Nobody even knows who he was, and all this kind of thing. And once he confronts them with some of the things like we've been talking about this evening, then they kind of get a little less loud, and you can kind of see. In fact, one fellow he's talking to about these things, and the guy said, "Thank you," and he goes and shakes his hand, and he said, "You've really cleared some things up for me. Thank you." Well, another thing is, how can God be one if Jesus is also God? Well, we've been talking about some of that lately, and that is, I can't explain that, but I don't have to be able to explain it to know that it's true. I can't comprehend certain things. I'm a mortal human being, and I'm not capable of understanding how there can be one God in three persons. I don't get how that works. It doesn't work in the way I think in space and time. But does that mean that God can't be that way in ways that I can't understand? I hope God can't be understood by me fully, because what kind of God would that be if Edwin can figure him out and give you an answer to all these mysterious questions? So it doesn't faze me that questions like this, how can God be one if Jesus claims to be God too? No, it just talks about some aspects of God and his nature that are transcendent to us in the way we deal with things. Then there's one that comes out a lot. There's no absolute truth. Well, okay. If there is no God, there is no absolute truth. Well, let's think about that for a minute. What kind of a situation does that put us in if, in fact, there is no absolute truth? There's no such thing as morality. You ever thought about that? It's just a social construct. Do all societies come up with the same morality? No. Some societies eat other people. To them, I'm sure, they think it's okay. The early inhabitants of New Zealand were eaten by the next people who came in. So there was not much trace left of them. This idea of morality, there's a thing called social Darwinism. Darwin's theory of evolutionary theory is survival of the fittest, which has been debunked and disproven, but nevertheless, survival of the fittest. So what did Hitler do? He was a social Darwinist. He took Darwin where he would naturally go if you're dealing with the human species. And he reasoned that the Aryan race was the superior race. And all these other races, especially the Jews, but there were several others that he didn't care for gypsies and a lot of other people either. The best thing to do to preserve the gene pool so that the best human beings will survive is just kill them. And he justified that by survival of the fittest. And why not? LaGard Smith, F. LaGard Smith, who once taught out in California at the Malibu campus of Pepperdine, taught law. He's living over in England now. He had students, Jewish students, who were part of this there's no absolute truth thing. And he said he was amazed that when he would ask these intellectual Jewish students who bought into this, there's no absolutes, we can't know what's right and wrong, he would ask them, what about Hitler? And they would say, well, Obviously, we don't like that Hitler did what he did, but we can't say it was wrong. That's how strong this can affect people, to come up with such foolishness as that. So I saw this one person who says, I must see it to believe it. Unless I see it, I won't believe anything. And so she was asked, have you ever saw something and realized you saw it in a way that wasn't true? You ever done that? You ever thought you saw something, or thought you understood something, or thought you encountered something, and then later on you realize, well, now wait a minute. There's probably more than that. So when she said, well, yeah, he said, well, then you don't know anything either. Because it doesn't matter if you see it or not. According to you, you don't even trust what you see. Francis Schaeffer, who was a very popular theologian when I was a young man, he had a place over in Switzerland, Le Brie, where folks would go over and talk about the Bible and Jesus. And he was a very conservative man. But he would have conversations with the intellectual elite who had these notions about we can't know what reality is and all of this. And he said one of the things he would do is they're sitting and they're talking about, musing on things, and they're saying, we don't know what reality is. And he says, do you know if there's a door there? No, you don't really know if there's a door there. What about the wall? Well, you just don't really know that. He said the one thing he always noticed was they always left by going out the door. And that's kind of how it works. The proving things absolutely mathematically is something that you really can't do with much of anything. But we live on the basis of evidence. I was mentioning to the class this morning, when you cross the street, can you prove scientifically to the nth mathematical degree that you will make it to the other side? No, you can't. Are you afraid to cross the street? No, you're not. Because our experience informs us about the world we live in. And indeed, when we go out the door, it's a door. And if we decide to go out the wall, it doesn't work so well. So the objections, looked at some of the basic ones tonight that people raise. The main reason it has been sort of demonstrated when these things are pursued that people get into this is they don't like what believing in God would mean. They don't want to be restrained by the teachings of Jesus. And so the best way to sort of avoid that is to just try to say, that's a bunch of foolishness. Nobody even knows it. Some people even go so far as to say, we don't even know if Jesus really lived, which is really absurd. Of course we do. There are all kind of reasons why we know that Jesus lived. So we don't have to worry about these things. There are answers to what ultimately turn out to be the quibbles of those who don't want to deal with God. So, what will we do with God? What will we do with Jesus? He's very well attested to. The Gospels present him with a coherence and with something that is, you look at it and the world has marveled at Jesus. He's not some slap together something that people put together well after the fact to justify some of their regional things that they liked and preferred. No, the Gospel present a cogent picture of this man called Jesus. And all the evidence that we have, the resurrection being the clincher, there is no explanation for the empty tomb that makes any sense whatsoever, but that he arose. So many things make absolutely no sense if he did not. And so many things make perfect sense if he did. So, this Jesus, who is real, has an invitation. Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon me, you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light.